In these short midweek episodes, which are a supplement to our ongoing history series on Sunday nights, I've been highlighting new additions to the Florida resort for those who are planning a trip in the near future and for those who would simply like to have a better idea as to how the resort is changing. So far, we've looked at Harmonious, Space 220, and Steakhouse 71. Today we're going to look at an expansion area in the France Pavilion at Epcot. The expansion area begins with a waterside path that leads to a new promenade that is directly behind the original pavilion, an area that is meant to evoke the architecture specifically of Paris. Some pavilions in World Showcase are an amalgam of different country regions unified into a single presentation. The Canada Pavilion, for example, features elements of the Rocky Mountains, the Hotel du Canada modeled after a hotel in Ottawa, Bouchard Gardens from Canada's west coast, and a maritime village from Canada's east coast. It places these architectural and landscape elements side by side to create a pavilion that speaks to the culture of the entire country. In contrast, the original France Pavilion was arranged largely after elements that exist in just one city, Paris. Not only that, these are architectural and landscape elements that can mostly be tied to one period in the city's development, which is referred to as the Beautiful Age, basically from the second half of the 1800s. When Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew was the mayor and Baron von Haussmann was the city's master planner. This was a public works program that created some of the most identifiable architectural elements in Paris, most of which still exist today. Parks and squares, public fountains, buildings that would offer cafes and small shops, and areas of green space. Also, this renewed vision for Paris would include bridges and tree-lined roads to join existing neighborhoods with the city center. The original France Pavilion at Epcot includes nods to many such elements originally built during this period, even including a bridge. The France Pavilion was inspired by modern-day Paris, but mostly focused on those areas that were built between 1850 and 1900. The expansion to the pavilion continues with many of these same architectural elements, highlighting neighborhoods of Haussmann's Paris as they exist today. The entrance to this new expansion area, down a tree-lined boulevard, includes cast-iron canopies that mark metro stations in present-day Paris. This entrance path leads to another tree-lined boulevard complete with lampposts and a fountain, again echoing the dominant design features of Haussmann's Paris. One of the interesting things to notice in this expansion area are the three-story walk-up buildings, similar to the multi-story structures built during the period that Bonaparte's nephew and Haussmann oversaw during the beautification of Paris. As opposed to most cities that largely segregate families based on income, such as in many American cities, where there are wealthy neighborhoods and less wealthy neighborhoods. These buildings, as replicated here, were initially designed to mix classes. The bottom floors, often with large rooms, were typically rented by one family of means. The second floor, perhaps divided into two apartments, was typically rented to middle-class families. And the upper floors, may be divided into four smaller apartments, were rented to four working-class families or individuals. In a world before elevators, the upper floors were also the least expensive because residents needed to walk up multiple flights of stairs. But these buildings allowed the open street areas to mix people from different financial backgrounds. To relate this back to Disney, Walt saw his park in California, Disneyland, as a place where people from different financial backgrounds were gathered together in a common experience. That is even true out in Florida. In terms of the hotels, the Florida property functions like an American city. The hotel areas divide up families based on income levels. There's the deluxe, the moderate, and value hotels, which, for the most part, speak to three different income levels for visitors. But the parks themselves then mix all of these groups together in common pathways and in various attractions. But to get back to the expansion area, This new boulevard is lovely, filled with strong attention to detail. There's real shutters, wrought iron flower boxes, a mix of roofing materials from metal to slate to shingles. There's a metal and glass gazebo next to the outdoor fountain. Everything looks fabulous, with one exception that is just maddening. Most everything here has depth and texture, and in general has a strong feel of authenticity, except for this. The cul-de-sac end of the boulevard, if you look up behind the first row of buildings for the illusion of depth, are a second row of buildings. But that second row of buildings are just painted flats, which is particularly noticeable in the midday sun. But other than that, this is a lovely expansion that feels richly detailed. And layered into this environment of mock realism are playful elements from the film. Parked at the end of the street are the red and black scooters driven by Chef Skinner and Colette. The food critic from the film, Anton Ego, is commemorated on the labels of wine bottles featured in one shop window. And the manhole covers that lead presumably to the sewer are stamped with the image of Remy, referencing one sequence in the film where Remy paddles through the sewers of France using a spatula as an oar. At the end of the street is what I would call a D-ticket adventure inspired by the film Ratatouille. To start with, I'd like to proclaim that 2021 is the year of the charming queue. Out in California at the Secret Life of Pets Off the Leash over at Universal Hollywood, one of the most inventive aspects of that experience is the queue, where guests move through a New York apartment building to explore the units where these animals live. Remy's Ratatouille Adventure has an equally inventive indoor queue. The queue moves guests along the rooftops of Paris until you find an animated sign for Gusteau's. In this room, the ride premise is laid out for you. Remy will make you a meal, and from there you move into another room that is a painter's workshop where the artist paints still lifes of food, and from there you pick up your 3D glasses and move to the load area. The ride itself is a mix of physical environments and 3D screens. You ride on a trackless vehicle platform on which is mounted a motion base. So think of this ride system in ways as the moving trackless vehicle from Rise of the Resistance paired with the type of moving motion base in Flight of Passage. That is, the seated area has a separate set of movements from the rolling movements of the vehicle. The ride overall is a delightful experience. But to nitpick a little, the experience mixes two representations of reality. In Flight of Passage, for example, the ride experience is entirely a presentation on 3D screens, meaning that your mind focuses on one type of presentation. In Remy's Ratatouille Adventure, the presentation shifts back and forth from 3D screens to dark ride stages, which are arranged as physical sets. To constantly switch between those two mediums reminded me of the constructedness of the experience, so I never really fell into either of the two environments. Rise of the Resistance does a better job of seamlessly blending screens with physical sets, as except for that return flight in Rise, you're almost always in an environment that uses both elements simultaneously. But beyond that, here are the things that I particularly admired about Remy's Ratatouille Adventure. The screen presentations are lovely. The seating area mounted on a tilting motion base perfectly matches the screen movements. This is one of the best blends of movement and 3D imagery in any ride. This ride also uses far more than sight and sound to create the experience. There's a blast of heat as the ride vehicle passes beneath an oven. A splash of water as a bottle of champagne is opened, wind as vehicles race down a hall, and the syncopated jostling of the motion base as the vehicle passes presumably over uneven boards. Like Frozen Ever After, this is an attraction that highlights a region, in this case Paris, through elements of a Disney or Pixar film. The other highlight of the expansion area is the Crepe Restaurant, La Creperie de Paris. The restaurant features crepes, which are made from lighter flour and offered with fruit or other sweet fillings, and galettes, which are made with darker buckwheat flour and are offered as savory entrees. The buckwheat flour is imported from Brittany, which is a western region of France, far from Paris, as galettes are far more associated with that region. And here's where things get a little complicated in terms of design. The exterior of this restaurant speaks to the architectural style found in Haussmann's Paris, but the interior of the restaurant speaks to the architectural elements found in Brittany. Specifically, the interior of the restaurant mixes timber and cut stone, arranged in a way that visually distinguishes it from Haussmann's Paris. But there's a story here that is meant to explain all this. In terms of the fictional lore of this restaurant, presumably a person who was raised in Western France moved to Paris, where he decided to set up a restaurant that served crepes similar to those made in his hometown. To ornament and decorate the interior, he dressed it with traditional building materials and building styles found in Brittany. And so that, at least, is the official explanation as to why there's a Brittany-Paris matchup on this expansion street. But among the 3 new restaurants at the resort, this is my favorite. I've been there 3 times so far. It's also the most affordable of the new restaurants. It has a prefix menu for $33, which includes choice of soup or salad, choice of 1 entree galette, choice of 1 dessert crepe, and a glass of hard cider soda or juice. The 3 galettes I've had were excellent. The classic, which is ham and Swiss, the plie, which is chicken, cheese, and mushroom, and the salmon. My impression of the dessert crepes was a little more mixed. The gourmand, which has a hazelnut chocolate spread, was very good, as was the peach melba, but the caramelized apples on the palm were a little soft and overcooked. To round this out, you receive a glass of hard cider, and you have 3 options. The 3 options relate to sweetness. They are sweet, modestly sweet, and dry. The modestly sweet, the demi-sec, was easily the best of the lot. There are no advance reservations required for Le Creperie. The times that I've been there, which include 2 dates on weekends, the wait was minimal, maybe 15 minutes or a half hour. In person, once you are at the door, you can even request a seating time later in the day. So if you drop by at 10 in the morning, you can request a seating for dinner at 6 p.m. The one time that I did that, I was seated almost immediately when I returned. I should also add that I was never able to finish a prefix meal by myself. I'm 6'2" and I'm a guy, and even for me, the prefix menu was too large for me to finish alone. For most couples, I'd suggest ordering 1 prefix menu and then a second galette and a second drink. All items can be ordered a la carte. For most couples, that's probably more practical than ordering 2 prefix meals. One more thing. The Creperie has a walk-up window. The crepes there come from the same kitchen. But for the most part, the versions of the crepes that are served at the walk-up window are pared-down versions with fewer ingredients compared to the versions served inside the sit-down restaurant. They're also slightly cheaper. I went to the walk-up window once, was somewhat disappointed, then returned next time to the indoor experience. Of the 3 new restaurants we've recently discussed on this podcast in terms of just food quality, its flavors, its uniqueness at the resort, and its presentation, I'd place the 3 restaurants in this order. First, Le Creperie, second, Steakhouse 71, and third, Space 220. In terms of a unique experience in which the environment and the food together present a memorable meal, I'd place them in this other order. First, Space 220, second, La Creperie, and third, Steakhouse 71. In terms of overall value, Le Creperie easily beats out the other 2, so much so that though I doubt we'll see price increases at Space 220 anytime soon, I expect we might see a modest increase at Le Creperie. For those who are particularly value conscious, you can go to Le Creperie, order a $16 galette, and enjoy the full experience of the restaurant. As an entree, the $16 galette is better than nearly any other entree at the resort in the same price range. And that is our overview of the new experiences offered in the expansion area at the France Pavilion. I'll be back on Sunday to continue our story about the opening of Walt Disney World, a story that even for die-hard Disney World fans likely has some details that haven't been discussed in the last 50 years. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. In short, this show can't exist without subscribers. If you enjoy these episodes, please support us by becoming a monthly subscriber over on Bandcamp. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.